Well, it's so good to see all of you this morning. Our prayers, of course, are with a lot of the women who are at the women's retreat this weekend. We're hoping that they make it back here today safely. And you see, we kind of had an acoustic sort of band this morning, but it was still just as good as every other Sunday. And that last song in particular is so powerful. As we sing, I hope that we contemplate the words that are coming out of our mouths, that we are professing to God in song. And that one part in particular, I was thinking about how it says, I'm desperate for you. I'm lost without you. I'm desperate for you, God. And are we truly desperate for God? Think about what it means to be desperate for something. I think many of us out in the crowd today would acknowledge the fact that, for instance, we probably couldn't stay up all night for no reason. It's a little difficult to do that. But if you remember back in college, I'm sure many of us, or back in school, many of us remember staying up all night plenty of times, especially when it came down to test time. I remember myself personally, I had a 27-page paper due in an archaeology class. Took biblical archaeology, a lot of fun. Kind of procrastinated, and suddenly it's 2 days before the big paper's due. I didn't do too hot on the midterm, and this is one of 3 grades, so I stayed up pretty much 2 straight nights, taking naps here and there throughout the days, and got the paper in. And why did I stay up? How could I stay up 2 straight nights doing that? Well, I was very desperate at that point. And that's what desperation can look like. It inspires us and motivates us to do things that we normally couldn't do. It makes us aware of what we truly need, what we need to prioritize. And I wonder if that's the way we are with God, because we can come here and sing, we can come here and pray, we come here and listen to sermons. We can do all of these things. But the fact of the matter is, if we try and do them out of our own power, out of our own ability, we can't do it. And we can only do it when we acknowledge the desperate need that we have for God in our life. Because I look around us in this world and I can see that life just isn't working out for a lot of people right now. If you don't believe that, or you're questioning it, you've got to look at how well self-help books and that whole industry is doing right now. People are looking for guidance. Because despite the success we have in this country, despite the affluence, we still recognize that there's a part of us that's very lost. And we're desperate. We're desperate at this point. I think you recognize that in a lot of countries where economically they do well, you have to wonder why things like suicide is so high in those countries. Why does that still happen? Why do people who seemingly have everything that we desire on a human level, why are they still so empty? I think you can see the fact that oftentimes you have to look at what they had to sacrifice to gain all that. Oftentimes it's relationships. Ultimately and foundationally, I believe it's ultimately the relationship of God that we sacrifice when we chase after the things of this world. And that will leave us empty. Because you see, we were made for relationships. God built us. It is not good for man to be alone. We were built to have relationships with each other as well as with God. They've actually done studies now, neurological studies, that show timeouts, isolation, solitary confinement. It shows why that's a punishment. There's an actual physiological effect it has on the brain when we are separated from other people. We were designed and created. But this relationship these days are becoming more and more fragmented. We kind of visited that last week, talking about how in a immediate satisfaction in the demands and ease that we have with technology, we oftentimes sacrifice our relationships because we've not trained ourselves to put time into these things. This is the second week of a new series we're calling The Good Life, His Plan, Your Relationships. And we're looking at how to better our relationships, and it focuses on one whole chapter of the Bible, 1 Corinthians 13, because ultimately it boils down to love. But we're going to take one verse out of that today, and we're going to focus in on something I'm sure we're all masters of, and that's patience. The reason why we focus on these things is for 3 reasons. First, relationships determine our happiness. They can be either the source, if you look in your own life and you look at your deepest source of fulfillment, it's probably a relationship. And even your deepest source of pain is probably from a relationship as well. Psychologists tell us that oftentimes our emotional problems are rooted in bad relationships, either with our parents, our families, our spouses. Secondly, our relationships determine our success. The American Management Association says that the most important skill that an executive looks for is the ability to work well with others. Rockefeller is quoted as saying, "I'll pay anything for that." Conflicts in the workplace are not quite as bad when the people involved know how to get along with other people, and part of that is patience with other people. Thirdly, our relationships develop our character. Who you are today is not going to be the same person you are 2 years, 5 years from now, and who you're going to be then 2 and 5 years from now is largely determined by the kind of things that we take in as far as media and information, but also who we hang around, the company that we keep. The Bible is full of proverbs and verses that talk about the need to keep wise counsel around us, to avoid the counsel of fools. So we saw last week that God says love, we're talking God's kind of love, not society's kind of love, must be the basis of all our relationships. And in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4 says, love is patient. Now, I'm not going to come to you as someone who has mastered this himself. I have way too many witnesses in my life. I grew up around here. I have too many people who could testify. This is something that I've struggled with from time to time in my life. Plenty of teachers will come forward and admit that. But if we're going to have big, healthy, growing relationships, we have to learn patience. There's all kinds of patience. There's that kind of patience you need when driving in traffic and you're late to an appointment. There's the kind of patience as you look forward to the day of a particular event. The way to sit and wait for that time to come. For baseball fans, it's opening day. For families, it might be that vacation you've got planned coming up. But today we're going to talk about the kind of patience when we have to deal with other people. So God tells us that if we're going to have these kinds of relationships, the first thing we need is patience. And how would God know that? Well, you have to remember, God's been dealing with humanity for thousands of years at this point. He knows what people are like. And He knows that dealing with people requires patience. You see this kind of picture in the Bible as it talks about this kind of patience. The word for it gives this picture of taking a long time to boil, kind of referring to water. It takes a long time to boil. In today's terminology, we would say they have or if someone who doesn't have patience, they have a short fuse. And this would mean that if someone's patient, according to the way the Greek would word it, they have a long fuse. This word is only used in the Bible, this word for patience is only used in referring to other relationships, to people with other people. Love is patient means that to be loving, to show love, we have to have patience. If you're impatient with people, then you're being unloving. Well, it's kind of an easy dichotomy to grasp. It's very black and white. So why is patience so vital? Why of all things must we start with patience? Well, first of all, because everybody's different. 1 Corinthians 12:6 says, God works through different people in different ways. Everyone's an original. We are all unique. We are not all built the same. How we handle things is different. How we relate to things is different. How we express things is different. If you have children, more than one, or if you have a couple, or even if you're married, you know that people are different. We're all made differently. And secondly, we need patience because our differences create misunderstanding. But because we're different, everyone's built differently. We all have our different way of taking things in. It creates misunderstandings. There's a writer named John Gray who writes in Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. He says, men mistakenly expect women to think, communicate, and react the way that men do. Women mistakenly expect men to feel, communicate, and respond the way women do. We have forgotten that men and women are supposed to be different. As a result, our relationships are filled with unnecessary friction and conflict. Clearly, recognizing and respecting these differences dramatically reduces confusion when dealing with the opposite sex. So our differences create misunderstandings. We have differences not because of just gender, but because of cultural backgrounds. We have differences because of age, because of where we grew up in the country. 1 Corinthians 2:11 says, "No one can really know that anyone else is thinking what he is really like, except that person himself." Should circle the words "no one" in that passage. Because oftentimes we think we have the understanding of somebody else, and therefore we have the ability to judge that person accordingly. But we always must recognize that being human, being finite in our knowledge, that there's always some piece of the puzzle we're probably missing, and there might be a very important piece that we're missing. One of the things that we are taught as you go to the mission field, and I think most people are taught when they have to deal with different cultures, is the fact that things are going to be different. The way communicating is different. Impatience comes from our misunderstandings. And misunderstandings comes from 4 wrong assumptions in our relationships. First is that words mean the same thing to different people. This is an important one, not just dealing in marriages, but when also you're dealing with anybody, is that depending on where they're from, words mean different things to different people. I was reading a blog by a British blog writer, and he said there are 10 things that Americans do that nobody else in the world can really understand. And one of the things was how we oftentimes respond when people are talking to us with the simple word, "really." Now to us, that's interesting. Tell me more. To the rest of the world, we've just questioned the validity of their conversation. He talked about an Italian friend who was visiting here in America and how he got so irate with everyone who just kept responding, "really," because he felt like they were calling him a liar. Different words be different. The same words can mean different things to different people. There's all kinds of connotations that come into play, and we don't even realize it because it's all cultural to us. It's not something that we study in school. It's in the very nature of who we are as Americans, as Virginians, as New Yorkers. Wherever you're from, these words have different meanings, even though they're the exact same words. The second kind of wrong assumption is the fact that there's only one right way to see things, and I think we all can admit that that's not true. In our logical moments, we can all admit that we're not true. Now, when we start to get a little impatient and a little hot under the collar, suddenly, yes, our way of seeing things becomes the only way to see this certain thing. But in our calm moments, we know that there are always more than one way to see something. The third wrong assumption is that my way is the right way. There's a lot of ways to skin a cat. And recognizing that there are other ways to get the same goal accomplished is something that we must be able to, and that's what builds compromise, is the idea that you have a way of doing things, I have a way of doing things, let's figure out a way that we can both agree on getting this one thing done. Melissa and I are coming up on 2 years of marriage here in a couple months, so we're still at that stage, we're getting to know each other a lot better, we still know each other better probably than we know most people, other people in the world, but there's always those occasions when we're like going out to run errands, or we're going out to get something done, and I'll lay out my plan to get it done, and then she'll lay out her plan to get it done, and we both kind of look at each other like, what are you thinking? Like, why would you do it that way? That way is totally inefficient. That way is totally irrational. Usually it ends up being whoever really cares less about getting the job done is going to end up caving on it. But there's still those moments when, you're talking about something and you're kind of like, what? And you look at the other person and you're like, where is that coming from? Like, what would make you say or do something in that way? Well, we're different, and there's always more than one way. And usually, I think most of the time, when I give in, okay, let's do it your way, you end up, and you're willing to open yourself up and not be so selfish as to hold on to your way of doing things, you'll actually learn something. And going through their process, you kind of begin to learn the way that person thinks. You get a little insight into why they chose to do it the way they chose to do it. The last wrong assumption is that I can figure out your motives. The truth of the matter is, like we already looked, you can't. You can give a good guess, an educated guess. You can take certain things and try to deduce, but the problem is that you do not have a complete knowledge. And so you can never assume that you have the truth when it comes to somebody else's motives. It's being presumptuous. That's why God says, be patient with everyone, because God, who is commanding us to be patient with everyone, is the one being who knows motives. He is the one person that knows exactly why we do the things we do. No other being, no angel, no demon, and no person has that kind of knowledge. And so the one who does commands us to be patient. So that's good. We all know that to be true, right? That we should be patient. The why, not too hard to understand. In the case of patience, it's always the how that gets difficult. It's always the how. First of all, we must remember, if we want to be patient with others, we have to be patient like God is patient with us. We remember how patient God is with me. We must always look to God, not just for the power, but also for the example of how He is patient with us. And this one is tough in and of itself. This one is why we should have quiet times on a daily basis. This is why we should read our Bible on a daily basis. This is not something that we can just flip a switch and understand. To try and understand how a holy God, creator of the universe, a being which sin can be no part of, completely holy and separate from those things, how He feels towards sin is difficult to understand. Then, how He feels towards sinners that He created is hard to understand. Then to try and contemplate and understand the love that He has towards those sinners is another thing that takes time to appreciate. I would say even takes a lifetime for us to grasp, for us to study, for us to meditate over, for us to fully appreciate exactly what God's wrath towards sin looks like, and then what it took, the kind of love, mercy, and patience that it took for God to save those sinners. In 1 Timothy 1:16, Apostle Paul says, "I was shown mercy so that in me, the worst sinner, Christ might display His unlimited patience." God chose me, Paul said. We don't know if Paul, with his own hands, murdered anyone, but we do know that he was an accomplice to murder, the murder of Christians. He was a persecutor. He'd run around, throw them in jails on the orders of the synagogues, and he would watch and stand by as some of those Christians were stoned. We know he was there for the martyr Stephen, held the cloaks of the men who were stoning him to death, and gave his approval. And yet, with the worst kind of sinners, and with all sinners, God shows patience. And of course, God not being a simple God, God being a complex, immortal, eternal being, has so many reasons for doing so. One of the reasons why He shows patience towards sinners is so that we can exude and show that same patience towards others in our lives. So when we go, next time we go to yell to the kids to hurry up and why it takes so long, take a quick moment to examine your life and see if there was any time that possibly God wanted to yell the same thing to you. Why it took so long for us to get it. Why it's taking so long for us to get it. I think oftentimes the fact that He showed patience towards sinners is one thing. I think the fact that He continues to show us patience as Christians who know the truth, who know the life of Jesus Christ, and yet continue to do the same things is also a completely different matter. The fact that God continually shows us patience should be an example to us. Like Romans 15:7 says, "Accept each other just as Christ has accepted you." Just as Christ accepted us in our state of sinfulness, so we must accept others. Remember how patient God is with me when you're looking for patience. Second, learn by listening. Learn by listening. Proverbs 19:11 says, "A man's wisdom gives him patience." Proverbs 14:29 says, "A patient man has great understanding." So circle wisdom and understanding. If you want to learn to be more patient, the key is understanding the other person. One of the things we have to do to understand somebody else is to listen. Listen with the intent of learning, not listening with the intent of responding or reacting. Just sit back and listen to what the other person has to say. Guys, don't look to fix the problem. Just look to listen at that stage and gain the understanding of why the other person feels or is thinking the way they do. The more wisdom you have, the more understanding you have, and the more you understand that person, the more patient you're going to be with them. One of the deepest needs for everybody is to be understood. That's one of the most frustrating things in the world, isn't it? When you've expressed an idea every which way you can, and the other person still is not getting it. And so at that point, we think we say it slower, if we say it louder, or if we say it again, somehow they're going to magically get the understanding that we hope. We have a deep need to be understood. No one can fully develop in this world and find a full life without feeling understood by at least one other person. No one comes to know himself through introspection or in the solitude of his personal diary. Rather, it is in dialogue, in his meeting with other people. It is in dialogue with each other that we figure out who we are and who God made us to be. That quote comes from a Paul Turnier. This is why we need relationships. So how can we better understand people that we are impatient with? Listen to them. By listening to them. Not just hearing the words, but listening to the thoughts and the feelings. Try to gain some empathy with that person. Try to understand them. Proverbs 18:13 says, "Listen before you answer. If you don't, you are being stupid and insulting." That's pretty clear. The point is, it's really hard to listen with an open mouth. A young man came to Socrates to have him teach him how to become an orator. He was talking incessantly, constantly talking. Socrates finally just put his hand over his mouth and said, "I'm going to have to charge you a double fee. I'm going to have to teach you two sciences. First, the science of holding your tongue, and the second, the science of using it correctly." Take a moment to rate yourself as a listener and be honest. On a scale of 1 to 10, how good are you at listening to other people? A lot of people want to call themselves a good listener because our culture recognizes the value in a good listener. So in a culture where we have to do we're all about self-promotion, honesty is hard to come by. In self-promotion, we would say, yeah, of course, I'm a good listener, but there's no need for self-promotion here. Just give yourself time to think about how good of a listener you really are. Because you see, 7%, the reason why we just can't hear words, and that's not just the end of listening, 7% of the meaning of what we say is communicated by the words that we use. 7%. We know this to be true because that's why things like sarcasm, irony, and other such things are really hard to get across over text, email, over social media. Because a lot of these things, a lot of the meaning that we convey with what we say, most of it does not come from our words. 43% of the meaning comes from the way we say it, how we say it. Vocal tone, pitch, volume, and delivery, the timing. The remaining 50% of the meaning is contained in non-verbal language. This is why eye contact is so important when we talk about communication. Actually looking at the person that you're talking to. You know before your spouse even says anything. You know when they're starting to get impatient with you. You know when they're starting to get frustrated. They don't need to say a word. There's just those little mannerisms that they have, the tics that they have, the twitch of the eyebrow, the stare. No words are spoken, but you know that somewhere along the line you did something to upset them, and now you got to frantically race back in history and find out what that offense was. You have to make allowances for each other. You have to just realize that people are imperfect. First, realize that you're imperfect. One of the things that I always say is the reason why that it worked out with Melissa and I and nobody else is because Melissa is the only person that is patient enough with me to put up with my antics. I think about all the other relationships in the past and how they didn't work. It's because usually I drove them nuts. Melissa has the patience and makes allowances for my faults. And in loving and doing so, I return the same allowances. The fact of the matter is you will never have a perfect spouse. You will never create or fix your spouse to the point of perfection. You have to make allowances. You need to treat others the way you want to be treated. And I'm going to finish off with that point because that's nothing new. That's the golden rule. We learned that one when we're kids, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. In fact, it's probably said so many times, we know it so well, that we've actually stopped paying attention to it. Philippians 2, 4 through 5 says, "None of you should think only of his own affairs. Consider others' interests also. Let your attitude toward life be that of Jesus Christ." And I think that's one of the most profound chapters in all of the Bible. Because he says that phrase, think of Jesus Christ. Have the same attitude of Jesus Christ. And then goes and explains what he means. Because you see, Jesus Christ is oftentimes talked about as a good teacher, a good man, but he's so much more than that. And it takes us, this is why we have to acknowledge the deity of Jesus Christ. Because if we do not acknowledge the deity of Jesus Christ, we miss, if we take away Jesus Christ's Godhood, we miss this whole point. Say, have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus. Verse 6, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. If there was ever a being in the history of this universe who had every right to, by position, deny the need of another being, another person, it was Jesus Christ, who is God. And though he was God, did not take that into consideration, didn't think that he needed to hold on to that, but instead emptied himself to become like one of us, to be made into the form of humankind, so that he could go and take on the sins of the world, be judged for sins he never committed. Think about that, from godhood to being judged as sinner. And think of the level of humility, the level of selflessness that required. That mindset is the mindset we are to adopt. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I found that most of the times when you try and force someone to change, they just become all the more resistant to it. But when you show them love, when you serve them, when you take care of their needs and show how much you care for them, when you do unto them as you would have them do unto you, they begin to reciprocate that exact same kind of attitude. So as we go to the Lord in prayer this morning, meditate upon that. Meditate upon that fact. Rather than think about our needs right now. On occasion, we do need to take into consideration the things that we are in need of to kind of examine if we are not taking care of ourselves. But today, contemplate the needs of those around you. And let's figure out how we can better serve those needs, especially the ones closest to us. Let's pray.